Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to speak here about the Tatlin exhibition. Simon Baier, he wrote an article in the catalog on the counterreliefs as painting.
Yes.
And I am Casper Bott, the curator of the Tatlin exhibition. We have here in the image, we see the Tatlin exhibition, the first big room. I would like to tell you very short, very concise, what was the idea of this exhibition, and then we would talk together with Simon Baier about or on some works. The idea to show Tatlin at the Tinguely Museum was an idea of Roland Wetzel, the director of the museum. He likes very well the Russian avant-garde, and the program of the museum is to show artists that have something to do with Tinguely, but not really in a strict sense. Tatlin and Tinguely never met, that's sure, but Tinguely was interested on the Russian avant-garde. He was also interested on the Russian Revolution. He knew some writings on Marx, Lenin, and so he liked to quote from them. He understand also himself as an artist who has also a social component, or an artist who has a component in social or political life. But Tatlin is sure also one of the ideals or of the great artists for Tinguely for some other reasons. One reason, Tatlin is maybe really the first artist to bring the element of movement in sculpture. And in the towers, we will speak about the tower, there are some inner elements that are moving in the idea of Tatlin. Or in the famous counterreliefs, there is also the idea of action, of doing them in an exhibition, the moment of mounting them or of showing them, yes. And only, when we walk across the art Basel now, we see some works that are in a corner, and to realize that this really Tatlin, the first artist who made this, then you see the importance for things that now are so normal to us. But he was the first artist to situate a relief or a counterrelief in a corner situation. Yes, the idea was to show Tatlin in his avant-garde position, to show Tatlin first as a painter. His paintings from his avant-garde paintings are all from 1910, 11, 12, 13. Then to show the three revolutionary moments in Tatlin's career. That would be the counterreliefs, understood from Tatlin as a sort of free painting that liberates him, the painting liberated from sujet and also from the plane. Then the monument to the Third International, the tower, and the Le Tatlin, the flying sculpture, flying machine of Tatlin. And then we have in the souterrain, in the second floor under, a sort of exhibition in the exhibition, Tatlin and the theater. And these are the big points on the Tatlin exhibition, because Tatlin is even more rich than we show him in all his in all his interests. He's really a sort of universal artist. He's also called the Leonardo from Moscow. Yes, if you visit the exhibition, you will see in this first big room there is, I would say, Tatlin at his best. All the original painting, the 10 paintings before the contrareliefs, and maybe you think 10 is not so much, but this is almost the complete avant-gardistic painted work from Tatlin. It's complete. Then the contrarelief we will see in some minutes. We have the chance to show here in Basel 2 or 3, or the 2 or the 3 only now existing original contrarelief of Tatlin. Then we show in 2 rooms, we show reconstructions. Our idea was to show every contrarelief, every sculpture of Tatlin that has existed once, that is now known only from photographs, to show at last one reconstruction, so to have an idea of the formal world of the sculpture of Tatlin. Then the next main point are the 2 tower reconstructions. On the left is the reconstruction, the Russian reconstructions that now is in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow from 1993, and the left is 15 years older. That's the reconstruction of the Centre Pompidou. That's this reconstruction that here in Western Europe is the most known, that there in some exhibition it was shown. And then the third great theme of Tatlin is, or of the exhibition also, is dedicated to Le Tatlin, this sort of flying sculpture. He had the dream that people could fly, like go with a bicycle, like something very natural, and he wanted to give the people the real sentiment of flying. He said the flying in an aircraft has not, the people have not the idea what is moving their body in the air. So, yeah. So and then the last section is theater. It's only that what I wanted to say about the exhibition. Maybe 2 words on the catalog. We tried to, or there are contributions from art historians and Tatlin experts from Russia, Europe, and the USA. We tried to make to show in the catalog like a glass of the momentane knowledge on Tatlin. And I read in the internet, I didn't realize that the English version of the catalog is the first as comprehensive or as a publication on Tatlin in the last 25 years. So yes, we are very happy to show this really important artist, Russian artist, and important for artistic reasons and also for historical reasons to show it here in Basel. But now I said enough. And yes, we have a little selection of works we would maybe like to speak, or do you have something?
No, maybe because you said at one point what maybe for Tinguely was important is the aspect of movement in the sculptures, which maybe is of course an aspect that is relevant for the tower, but it, as you said, is also already relevant for the so-called counter reliefs. Not only that, of course, they have it's not a plane where you stand in front of it, but you have to move around. And there are rumors that Tatlin even painted lines on the floor to kind of assign the particularly perfect positions for the viewer in front of the reliefs. But also the reliefs, sometimes one relief, for example, has a hinge where you can move it, or some parts could be moved. So that, I think, is one aspect that is interesting about those when we think about Tatlin from the contemporary perspective. But I think the other most important perspective is that in 1914, when he started to do this release, maybe we can show one of those releases.
We have made, yes, this painting here as representative of these 10 paintings of avant-garde, Tatlin as an avant-garde painter. Tatlin was, he escaped from home when he was 14, 15, and he went to sea, and he was a mariner, and with that he earned his life. He studied with this money, yes, and then this is one of the most famous Tatlin paintings, a wonderful painting. But now we will go to the counter reliefs.
Because we have to be fair, because I think in the end, I mean, this is not how he would have ever made a career as an artist with his paintings.
Probably not, yes, no. Probably not.
No, I think that was pretty clear, and he was clear about that too. And he made kind of course, a trip to Paris. He visited Picasso studios, where he saw in particular the guitar, which was around in reproduction, which is a guitar made of cardboard. And then he decided to kind of skip painting or finish painting, and for some reasons made an exhibitions really fast after he returned from Paris with those reliefs. And I think from a contemporary perspective, this is still kind of a problematic move for an artist which is still with us, that the question arises, how can I form material? How can I give form to material if I don't produce any longer within the traditional boundaries of, for, let's say, sculpture and painting, which for modernism in general, of course, is the decisive framework in which you kind of can make decisions how you form material. And the minute he kind of opens up this field and is no longer producing painting in the narrow sense, this question, of course, immediately arises, like how to form this material. If you don't represent anymore with material, of course, that was already a problem for abstract painting, but if you don't even have painting anymore to refer to as kind of a formational historical framework, then the question becomes really crucial, like, when I have a sheet of metal, why should I bend it, or why should I cut it? What's the reason? When is it a successful piece? And I think for Tatlin, this immediately became a problem to think about that problem, that you have to think about materials in general and form in general, or plasticity in general, and no longer about painting and sculpture. And I think that's, I mean, of course, when you walk around the art fair, that's kind of common sense now for most of artists, that within the traditional boundaries, it is really difficult to produce valid work. And Tatlin was one of the first artists who made this step in a very radical way, at least in 1914, 15, until 1919. Yes. Yeah.
And maybe it's important to realize that Moscow or St. Petersburg in these years was much more closer to Paris, Berlin, than it was later after the revolution. And one of the places you could see the best Picassos, the best Matisse in these years was Moscow, with these beautiful, famous collections that now are part of the Pushkin Museum, with the best Cézanne, Matisse. He knew that. Maybe we have a little other idea of the importance of the trip to Paris and the visit of Picasso's atelier, because I have a little impression that it was surely very important. You wrote also that he had the sentiment that he had to touch and to see how are these Picassos, this newest. But I think that I could even imagine that it would be possible without this trip to Paris.
No,
because
I think it would have been
this
possible.
presence of the avant-garde, of the Parisian avant-garde is very strong in Moscow in these years.
Yes, but I mean, Picasso's guitar was not in a collection, of course, and it was not visible anywhere. It was only in magazine as a photograph, and that was around in Moscow. And I'm sure Tatlin saw that already in 1930.
This is, I think, too. And maybe the aspect of the movement. It's also, we have to realize now this is an extremely rare, very important work, a museum work, but at the time when it was shown in the last Futurist exhibition, 010, people could touch that. That was new art, that it was not a problem to it. And so if you would move that, if you would touch that, this would stay in movement for some minutes. It has like a sort of life. I saw that when they came from Russia to put it on the wall, how this is like a life being, a sort of. I think this is an important aspect.
But then I think that's kind of a crucial kind of paradox in these works, that you have this kind of tactile aspect, but then on the other hand, when you look at this piece, you still have this idea of, for example, the wall functions as like the ground in a painting. And in some of the exhibition photos, you see that Tatlin made the wall with paper white. He made it completely white, so it looked like either like this kind of non-dimensional suprematist picture plane where those forms kind of hover, like immaterially. And I think he was kind of interested that you don't see the bricks or stuff of the wall, and he was interested that on the photograph it looks really pristine and white. That
I think too, and he made it for the eye and not for the touch. He says this famous "I will" that he says it only 1920, but he says in 1912 and the next years I said we want to put the eye under the control of the touching, but he says it's sure the eye is the important thing also for Tatlin.
Yeah, because there's another kind of sentence where he modifies it a little bit and he says he wants to perfect the eye.
Yes.
So in the end, it's still the eye that needs perfection and is not kind of negated through touch.
And it's so interesting that this seems to be is in this historical moment, it's a very modern, contemporary statement. But this is the old statement in the Renaissance art from the Paragone, the generations of artists, Leonardo and Michelangelo. They said painting is more important or sculpture is more important. This was this Paragone. And in a sort that are the same questions, but in a new context. And Tatlin said after, in the 20s, he said, it's not important if it's new or if it's old, it's important that it's useful. And maybe this is also the idea of such thinking that he never, this is, I think, an important point, he knew the Italian futurists also, but he never said, let's burn the museums, the old art is nothing. This is not Tatlin. He also liked the old painting. It's known that he visited the museums. He was, and this, when the Le Tatlin in 1932, he exhibits that in the museum that now is the Pushkin Museum. There is an Italian room, it's the biggest room, maybe for this reason, but this is the room where a copy of Michelangelo's David is also exposed. And I have a little impression that it's a sort of statement to say, Michelangelo, that's the old art, the academic stuff and also, but also he doesn't say I don't want that. But that's the old world, and Tatlin and my world is the new art for the new world. And there you have this also this sort of Renaissance thinking. The Renaissance people had the idea to create a new man, and the Russian avant-garde had also this idea to create a new man for their historical epoch. You are not so convinced.
I cannot help thinking that if you place yourself in 1930 in comparison to Michelangelo or something, or Leonardo, it looks a little bit comical too.
Yes.
And even this Le Tatlin airplane that he designed, it of course never really worked. And he knew that quite well.
Sure, sure.
And so I think it has a certain kind of, he makes himself very weak in that position in a way, because I mean he's not participating in the kind of productivist move going into the factories and so on. He prefers to kind of build this kind of primitive, not working airplane and puts it in a museum, which makes himself appear weak, I think, as an artist at that time compared to the productivists, but also weak compared to kind of other artistic movements, which was not productivist, but more going in the direction of like propaganda and like becoming more a journalist, for example, as an artist. But he places himself in this tradition and produces these useful things that don't work. I find it very interesting, but also strange, and that the model of the primitive, which doesn't work in the present, becomes the model for him, makes him an exception, I think, within the whole constructivist field.
There is also something like a poetical and maybe even absurd thing in Tatlin. He knew very well some poets that were a sort of absurd poets, and this is maybe rather important in all his work. That and important from him is also a theatrical to say, look at that tower. We will build it 400 meters and so. But probably he was the first who knew that it was never be possible. But this idea and this look at that this is the tower. This is the new world. And there he was a great artist in the sort of presentation of also of self-mystification. He made a myth from himself. Also others made a myth from Tatlin, but he was the first to make a sort of mystification. He was not interested in the facts. He always said so. It's also typical for Tatlin that he doesn't write on his art. You have only few statements on his art. From Malevich, you have a lot of theory. But Tatlin is not this kind of artist. Maybe he thinks that it's the artwork that has to speak. Yes, this is the second. We saw two works from by Tatlin. These are the two original contre-reliefs, and this one here was thought to be lost until 1990, and then it was found in the Russian museum. And during the Soviet Union, neither Tatlin nor Malevich, for example, were exhibited in the Soviet museums. And so this work had the chance not to be destroyed. Because maybe now we have to, yes, this, for example, is a not existing counter-relief, corner counter-relief from Tatlin, that in the show we have it in two reconstructions, one of Martin Chok in England and one from Dmitry Dimakov in Russia. And if you compare the two reconstructions, you will see these are two different works. It's not Tatlin, not at all, but they have all the two their own quality. And this is interesting maybe also if you think, yes, the question of a reconstruction, is this a work that we should show in a museum, or is it only a document, or what is it? And then you can ask what is a reconstruction of a town, Warsaw or Dresden after the war. What is this? It's not the real town, and here it's not Tatlin, but what is this? It's a sort of interesting, yeah, questions. The famous tower that was, Tatlin made two models of this monument to the Firth International. This one was the first, the most important one. He showed it 1920, first in Petrograd and then in Moscow. And 1925 he made a more simplified variant for an international exhibition in Paris. And all the tools have been lost in Russian museums. This tower is even now is in the books of the Tretyakov Gallery as an existing work, but the most probable possibility is that it was used as for fire, for heating during the war, but nobody knows it.
But maybe Tatlin would have liked that if he said
yes.
It's not important if it's new, but just if it's useful. Yeah. So it was useful at one moment.
It's a Tatlin story. Because 1925, when the other tower was shown in Paris, in a Soviet pavilion, you entered the pavilion and you had first the Lenin bust. Lenin was died a year before, but was Lenin, and then you had the tower. That means that 1925 also the Soviet Union saw in the tower the representative of the new world. And then with Stalin at the power, all changed. Stalin, it's a long story, but it's a sort of counter-revolution that all the most part of the ideals of the Lenin revolution were put aside, and then with the persecution, the strong bureaucracy and so on, it was another time.
But maybe, because yeah. I think, I mean, even if this work was never meant to be realized, I think it's a big exception somehow in Tatlin's work, because it's the only artwork where he thinks about using contemporary technology, for example, like screens, film, radio, transmission, and so on, because he was thinking that inside of this big tower, there's the legislative, the executive, and on top of the tower inside in a glass cylinder, the kind of media propaganda bureau, so to speak, for the state. So it was a very kind of let's say, a work that was meant to kind of really form the people in the state, and that was using contemporary technology to do so. And I think all the works that comes later, when he kind of is interested in this kind of primitive Tatlin, kind of taking the bird as a model for an airplane, is a completely different approach to kind of constructivist art, I would say. I have a hard time, for me at least, to kind of reconcile these two moments in his career, because this for me is like an exception where he is kind of in the present, trying to form the present, also from a political perspective, but also from a formal perspective. And then later he kind of wants to disappear from that present and takes models that are kind of like arch model yes, for flying, arch model for like, for example, he designs this vessel for feeding kids that is kind of designed like the breast of a mother. So he's more taking this kind of arch models for him as a kind of model to do artistic work and to form material. And that is more kind of wants to be in tune with something like nature or something, which in this case I don't think is so much present. So I think it's like this kind of meridian somehow for his work.
Yes,
it's like a dividing line.
It's also, what is it? Is it sculpture? Is it architecture? I'm not so sure what it is. It's a monument. The title is Project to the Monument of the Third International. And Tatlin in 1918, 1919 was rather near to the central power of the new revolution. He wrote a letter to Lenin. Lenin saw the tower. This is known, but it's not known what he said. And yes, he was in a sort of committee for the new museum. He was one of the person who reflected on the idea to make museums of contemporary art some years before, for example, the MoMA. There were also in Paris in the 19th, this with Art Vivant, this idea, but it's in this moment he's very modern and very thinking of this thing. And he had he thought about how should the new monument be. It's the time that where all the monument of the Tsar were destroyed or put away. The Tsar, yes. So, and this is also a response of this. It's like to see the new monument has to be something like that, and probably the proportions of this tower has also an anthropomorphic moment. And Punin, he says, we do not know how the representation of the new man will be. We do not know that, but it's sure that it will be very close to the new abstract, simple forms that the new artists make. And maybe is also this idea. So I think it's also a monument, a construct that has a lot to do with Baroque art. It's also it's a symbol of a revolution. In the word revolution means first the revolution in that sign, the movement. And yes, it's a very rich work that has made his career in the thinking of the people, not in the original as an object, but with some photographs. This is one of the most famous published in 1921. The reconstructions that we now have are all based on some photographs and some drawings. It's also said that Tatlin didn't make plans for this tower. Mm-hmm. And I think it's possible that he made some, but it's not this conceptual moment that sometimes has been put too much in the foreground.
Mm-hmm. But maybe one could also say, because I think since it was much more around as a photograph, that also makes him more contemporary in a way. Yes. That he is not interested in this thing as a real thing, as a real construction, but as a media coup somehow. Yes, and he was very aware of like how that could work, because there were a lot of channels of like magazines that went back and forth between Europe and Russia, and also the US at the time, where this tower was actually circulating, and he placed it within this network of circulation, and he was very aware of that from the start, that makes this piece successful and not the actual building of it. He made kind of processions with it and the photograph.
And it's sure that, for example, Le Corbusier knew perfectly these images. Le Corbusier also was building something in Moscow in the 20s. And it's also said that they met, but this is also a meeting that nobody knows nothing. But maybe we have, yes, this is a part of the Tatlin shown on a flying show 1933 in Moscow. Yes, Tatlin had the impression that man in a former evolutionary story was maybe a flying man, yes. And then that this has been lost, and then with the new flying machines, he has lost it at all, this sentiment of flying like a bird. but this is also maybe more a poetical idea than really his convincing. We do not know, because maybe this theatrical aspect. And he says, look at the beautiful. This is, excuse me. This is an original part of the Tatlin that now is in Greece in the Kostakis collection, and he says, referring to probably to this work, look at the beautiful lines of this sculpture. Isn't that a perfect form? And yes, and I think Tatlin had the idea that it was enough to find the perfect form for a flying machine like he imagined it, and then it would go. Maybe like the violin, that you have a perfect form that man found, the Italians found 400 years ago, and this form you cannot make it more perfect. And it's a sort of thinking I have, as an artist, I have to find the perfect form. That's he also says, I am artist, I give the ideas, I am an artist. He doesn't say I am the engineer who makes all the calculations. And so, yes, and I think we have to close in some little minutes. The theater aspect of Tatlin, and there are some people, some visitors of the exhibition who like the theater exhibition even more than all the rest. He worked for the theater in all his career, but the most of his projects for the theater, he made them without an concrete Auftrag. It was not a demanded work from a theater to say, we want a stage design by Tatlin. He made that to show that in exhibitions. And here it's on the Flying Dutchman from Wagner. It was never represented with this stage. This is a painting on canvas, 1.50 meters. It's the most beautiful work for theater, I think, from Tatlin. And it's clear he makes that to show it in exhibitions. And he paints that in a moment that he says, I have abounded the painting. He makes the contrareliefs. It's in the same year that from the two contrareliefs we saw before, it's the same time. And he is not a painter, but he makes, it's like a sort of a second level where he cultivates painting. Yeah. And when you know the Flying Dutchman and you see this painting, you can't avoid to hear the music. It's a sort of synesthetical quality, maybe. And I think it has a lot to do with the counter-relief. Or what do you think?
I don't know. With this in particular, I'm not sure, but I think, for example, when he did also a stage design for a Klepnikov play, the Sangaisi, I think that there it is very clear also the costumes, how he treats the wood and the fabric and the costumes is very similar to certain compositions of the counter-reliefs. I think that's very clear at that point. Also that he kind of doesn't want to abandon the idea of the counter-relief as non-functional, of course, but also that it is part of a certain stage. And I think he thinks about the exhibition space as a certain stage when he, for example, then prescribes the way the viewers should take in front of the relief. Of course, then suddenly the exhibition space is like a stage where an actor is implicated somehow. And I think that's, of course, this kind of this dimension that opens up with the counter-reliefs is the exhibition space as a theater stage.
And in the Zangesi, but we are now finishing, this Zangesi representation in 1923, that is probably the last important futurist theater performance, was a sort of total art work, because Tatlin was the actor, was the regisseur, he was all, the stage designer, and in the pause, in the interval between they took parts of the elements of the stage design to the foyer of the theater and made an exhibition for 20 minutes. And there was Punin who made a conference on these works. So it was a sort of a total art work or performance. I think we have to close. I can only invite you to see the exhibition, and thank you that you were disposed to speak about Tatlin. And yes, thank you very much for coming.